Further into Kandinsky, the language of form and color, and he's talking about the inner need of art to move sort of toward the eternal and objective, the inner need of artists. And that's what's going to lead him to talk about the language of color. This is from page 35 on Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And he says, quote, the inner need is the basic alike of small and great problems in painting. And again, for me, this is relevant to the context of group work, and I'd recommend reading the description of the playlist, but I'll move on. We are seeking today for the road which is to lead us away from the outer to the inner basis. The spirit, like the body, can be strengthened and developed by frequent exercise. Just as the body, if neglected, grows weaker and finally impotent, so the spirit perishes if untended. And for this reason, it's necessary for the artist to know the starting point for the exercise of his spirit. The starting point is the study of color and its effects on men. Kind of ironic that my camera is sort of veering between like highly oversaturated and no color. Anyway, I'll leave that be. And he says, there is no need to engage in the finer shades of complicated color, but rather at first to consider only the direct use of simple colors. Okay, to begin with, let us test the working on ourselves of individual colors, and so make a simple chart which will facilitate the consideration of the whole question. Two great divisions of color occur to the mind at the outset, into warm and cold, and into light and dark. To each color, there are therefore four shades of appeal: warm and light, or warm and dark, or cold and light, or cold and dark. Quote, generally speaking, warmth or cold in a color means an approach respectively to yellow or to blue. Warmth with yellow and cold with blue. This distinction is, so to speak, on one basis, the color having a constant fundamental appeal, quote, but assuming either a more material or non-material quality. Okay. The movement is a horizontal one. Quote, the warm colors approaching the spectator, the cold ones retreating from him. So this is where it gets quite interesting. So the basic idea is that the book itself is an artistic expression, and includes a great variety of different emotional notes about art. So the idea here is that, again, go back to the section on the movement of the triangle. He describes, quote unquote, the spiritual triangle, which is a sort of way of dividing humanity into a triangle. And he talks about the movement of this triangle, about the sort of, you could call evolution of humanity or development of spirituality, development of consciousness. And so the idea is that this metaphor or analogy, I would say, it applies to the book itself. So the book is a kind of triangle, and he's saying that, again, with warm colors, warm colors approach the spectator or the reader, the warm colors in an artwork, or the warm colors in the book, right? The warm tones in the book. And the cold, quote unquote, colors move away from the spectator, from the reader. And so if we understand the book as a triangle, it's in the dimension of depth. So there's a way that the beginning of the book is far more heated in its language. And I would also say that the end of the book is far more heated. And the middle sections of the book are more abstract and, in a way, more colder. And so there's a way of seeing that the two ends of the triangle are closer to the reader or spectator, and the middle sections move move away. Yeah, so here coldness is connected with the abstract and in the middle, whereas each of the ends, literally like the beginning and the end, are closer or nearer and also warmer. So again, the idea is that his language about the language of color, his discussion of the language of color applies, and also the spiritual triangle applies to the book itself. Quote, the colors which cause in another color this horizontal movement, while they are themselves affected by it, have another movement of their own which acts with a violent separative force. Okay, so what does this mean? So he's talking about how different colors in relationship to one another, when nearby each other, cause different kinds of this horizontal movement. So closer to or further away, but they're also affected by that movement. But one way of reading that they are themselves affected by this kind of movement is that he himself, as the author, is affected by this. So there's a way, look, he's talking about the relationship between the author himself and the reader, where the colors that he uses in the text, namely the heat that he uses or the coldness that he uses in the middle, as I said, they cause the reader to either move closer or move further away. And he is himself affected by this use of color in his own work. As he said, there's another movement of his own which acts with a violent separative force. So he's talking about the way that his own humanity actually is pulling Kandinsky away from the reader into his own abstraction. Whoop. I actually do want that back. So here, he says, quote, "This is therefore the first antithesis to the inner appeal, and the inclination of the color to yellow or blue is of tremendous importance." Okay, so he's talking about, again, our inner need to express creatively or artistically toward the eternal and objective. And he's talking about something that gets in the way of that. And he talks about that as a rather than this horizontal movement of colors, that they have a kind of movement of their own, which acts with a violent separative force. So the question would be about whether you experience the beginning of the book or the end of the book as more expressive of the eternal in artistry. There's a way that I feel, again, that the middle sections of the book are colder and in a way more subjective, and more separative. So there's the way that his abstraction and I would say his descent into subjectivity is in a way the most deeply human, but also the most deeply subjective, and that in that sense the most deeply temporal. Whereas I feel that the beginning and the end of the book are warmer, more inclined toward connection, and more, I would say, in a way, more eternal. Obviously, there are other ways of looking at it. Now he says the second antithesis is between white and black, i.e., the inclination to light or dark caused by the pair of colors just mentioned. And so here I would say that he's talking about which aspect of the self is dominant. Yeah, so again, both ends are closer to us, whereas the middle section of the book, I would say, is further. It moves further into depth, into abstraction, into sadness, into distance, further into individuality. further into fear, and also further into ego strength. So in a way, this is why I've sort of said I'm not saying it's sort of dishonorable. It's in a way it's more human, but is also in a sense harder to connect with, although definitely relatable. He said yellow and blue have another movement which affects the first antithesis, an eccentric and concentric movement. So he's talking here about these kinds of movements. Blue is to go inward. So again, there's a way that the middle section of the book has deeper depth, and it's oriented towards sadness. As an aside, I published a discussion on poetic space as the dwelling of the holy, dimensionality, and the between in Heidegger, in the section on in the playlist on the new gnosis. And the relevance of that is that Heidegger talks about the sky and blue as metaphors for the gods there, and that's very relevant to this discussion of blue. But I'm going to leave this aside and sort of talk about how, again, there's a way that the middle section of the book is oriented toward deeper interiority. It's more introverted and it has a more introverting quality. See how it goes inward, it goes toward itself. Whereas I would say that, again, the beginning and end of the book are more oriented to extroversion and warmth. Okay, and he just wants to clarify something about his use of the terms outer and inner, which I feel is relevant. He says the term outer, which is being used here. Again, he said we're sort of seeking for the inner way, away from the outer, toward the inner basis of artistry. The term outer used here must not be confused with the term material used previously. So this understanding would have it that both sort of abstract forms or non-material forms in art and material or sensory, earthly forms could be, either of them could be outer or inner. Yeah, he just says, I'm using material to mean outer need, which never goes beyond conventional limits, nor produces other than conventional beauty. The inner need knows no such limits, and often produces results conventionally considered ugly. But ugly itself is a conventional term, and only means spiritually unsympathetic, being applied to some expression of an inner need, either outgrown or not yet attained. But everything which adequately expresses this inner need is beautiful. So it's what he's talking about here is a way that the inner need can be deeply unconventional, but also it's not as much bounded by conventionality. And so it can be regarded as ugly, but because it's more, in a sense, deeply connected to the eternal, in a way, it's more, yeah. So that's maybe a little bit of a revision of what I was saying earlier. There's a way that again, it seems like what is blue, what is further in depth, abstraction, sadness, distance, individuality, fear, and ego strength. All this to me is sort of pointing more toward the eternal and might be regarded as ugly because kind of shadowy, but ugly is itself a conventional term. And again, everything that expresses this inner need is beautiful. Okay, so now he says, yeah, he's talking about these two kinds of movements, eccentric and concentric. If two circles are drawn and painted respectively yellow and blue, brief concentration will reveal in the yellow a spreading movement out from the center and a noticeable approach to the spectator. That's so fascinating. So look, we have the idea of extroversion, right? Extroversion is classically associated with gregariousness, social warmth, even to the point that if you look at the um, what would you say, the Likert scales used to measure Big Five traits, the Big Five model of personality, such, for example, trait extroversion, warmth is on there. So look, in personality, so look, this is